We're going to go ahead and get started if that's all right. Good afternoon and welcome to the Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission's hearing on defending prisoners of conscience. Prisoners of conscience are persons in prison for the peaceful expression of their political, religious, or other conscientiously held beliefs, even though they have neither used nor advocated those for violence. As the number of prisoners of conscience, or POCs, continue to increase globally, and as the space for civil society continues to shrink under authoritarian governments, it is vital that the international community, and Congress in particular, bring attention to those in prison for peacefully exercising their most basic human rights and work to secure their freedoms. In 2012, the Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission launched the Defending Freedom Project to help members of Congress advocate for the release of POCs around the world. Through this Defending Freedoms Project, or DFP, members adopt incarcerated prisoners of conscience, highlight their circumstances of the imprisonment, and stand in solidarity with the prisoner through letters, floor speeches, op-eds, and other actions to keep them and their situation in the public eye so that they're not forgotten. The advocacy efforts of members and their staff have often contributed to better prison conditions, the reduction of prison sentences, and even their release. Today's witness organizations are all partners working on the DFP to identify and advocate for prisoners of conscience. They will focus on a variety of POCs, including those who are imprisoned as journalists, religious leaders, scientists, human rights and democracy activists, and scholars. We thank you for your commitment to this vital work and for coming to share your expertise with us today. I want to thank my fellow members of the Commission who are fighting on behalf of the prisoners listed under the DFP. I look forward to hearing about their experience doing this kind of advocacy. We also hear the powerful statements from several prisoners who have been released and from the family members of several who are still incarcerated. In light of this important work, Co-Chair Mcgovern and I will be introducing a resolution expressing support for the designation of a Prisoners of Conscience Day. This resolution will bring attention to the thousands of prisoners of conscience around the world and will underscore the importance of prioritizing and protection in the freedom of these prisoners and as a United States foreign policy goal. I actually first became involved with the Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission when I was invited to advocate for a prisoner of conscience through the Defending Freedoms Project. For several years now, I've sought to bring attention to the unjust imprisonment of democracy activist Zhu Yufu in China. Zhu is a poet who was imprisoned for his view that the people of China should be able to believe and express themselves according to their own conscience. For this, he received a 7-year prison sentence under very harsh conditions. The Defending Freedoms Project consists of other similar heroes of human rights. Currently, we have over 20 prisoners of conscience who do not have a member of Congress advocating on their behalf. My desire is to see my congressional colleagues adopt each of these prisoners, beginning even today. Over on the side table, we have the profiles of each prisoner of conscience in need of an advocate. We encourage you to select one of these prisoners who has not yet been adopted to take this opportunity back to your member and to email or otherwise let the Commission know of your selection. We will then send you a custom starter kit to help your office in the advocacy effort. This is an easy way for your office to make a difference on international human rights for one person. I'd like to close my remarks by reading a statement from Zhu Yufu's son that he wrote for this hearing. I, Zhu Ang, the son of Zhu Yufu, represent my father to give his current situation. This is on the basis of personal visits with my father and my mother, and I have made monthly over these past years. Zhu Yufu was sentenced to 7 years for inciting subversion in 2011 while he wrote a well-known poem, It's Time. That is the third imprisonment since he participated in the establishment of the China Democratic Party in 1998. He still is in prison now. His first prison term started in 1999, and he served 7 years for subversion of state power. This first imprisonment was so cruel at the time, sleep deprivation used during interrogation, threatening his family, inciting criminals to beat him together. After his sentencing, he experienced 24-hour surveillance, confinement, and continuous standing as frequently used punishment. After a beating, he was sent to the hospital for a perforated eardrum. Then the international community noticed such human rights disasters happening in China, both to my father and to other political prisoners. The news reported on this, and political leaders from several countries met with the Chinese government. Then the Chinese government dealt very deceptively with the international community when it came to my father. They asked my father to confess in exchange for better treatment and told the outside world my father was living well. While my father refused to plead guilty, all his reading privileges, relief, and medical treatment were suspended, even for years. During the second imprisonment, my father was accused of obstructing official business and sentenced to 2 years in 2007. When the police pursued his friend for no reason, my father and I were taken away. We were sent to the same detention center but had different rooms. My father still did not plead guilty, but this time he was most worried about me. I told him I was okay, but my rib was fractured after a prisoner hit me. The world knows few details about this period since it was not named a political crime, but in fact, we were politically sentenced and persecuted. The most recent imprisonment has lasted until now. The world put much effort into reporting my father's plight. He is already an old man now with severe diseases all over his body. He never got the chance to receive medical treatment for his gallstone, spine ache, cardiac tumor, or prostatitis. Prison officers exempt him from daily labor, and sometimes he is given the right to write and draw. However, chances for exercise, chats, and mail are still rare. Family visits have been restricted, and no conversation about anything other than family-related subjects are allowed. He is not allowed to read the Bible. Other prisoners and officers scolded and humiliated him from time to time. They always seek to destroy his confidence, but he still keeps up hope. He knows I am safe and have gotten back my job, my friends, and my normal life in another country, for which many people exerted effort. In February 2017, my father was cast down by a prison officer and fainted. The U.S. Congress learned of this very soon and was concerned about it. Even though the prison officers lied and declared to the public that my father fell down by himself, they dare not arbitrarily hurt him like this again. In the last conversation state security officers had with my father, they threatened to keep him under house arrest after his release. I know that there is no ultimate solution for saving my father unless he is set free. I appreciate all the kindness from people who have kept up their concern for my father and others. I'm so worried about his coming release. They may do nothing but move him from one jail to another. All I can do is just tell the truth and let history make the judgment. Now it's my privilege to recognize our co-chairman, Jim Mcgovern.
Well, thank you, and I want to thank my colleague and co-chair, Randy Hultgren, for his statement and his passion and his commitment on issues that I think all of us in this room believe are so important. And I want to welcome you all here to the Tom Lantos Rights Commission hearing on defending prisoners of conscience. I want to welcome all of our witnesses, each of whom represents a commission partner in the Defending Freedoms Project. Your work is crucial for the Defending Freedoms Project and so much else, and so we appreciate all that you do. I want to take this opportunity to announce a new partner in the Defending Freedoms Project, and that is Scholars at Risk. Scholars at Risk is a U.S.-based international network of more than 500 institutions of higher education, including 16 in my home state of Massachusetts, whose mission is to protect scholars and promote academic freedom. The network assists more than 300 threatened scholars worldwide every year, investigates and speaks out against attacks on higher education communities, and empowers scholars and students to expand the space for free expression and inquiry. The freedom to think is a fundamental right we sometimes take for granted in this country. But many prisoners of conscience around the world are in jail because they exercise this right. People who think differently cannot help but challenge authority, and that's always a problem for insecure authorities. So on behalf of the Defending Freedoms Project, I am happy to welcome SAR today as a new coalition member. I think many of us have probably had the experience of waking up in the morning, reading or listening to the news, and being overwhelmed by how bad it is. The unending capacity of our fellow human beings to inflict harm on one another and the sheer scale of the resulting misery can seem overwhelming. That is why advocating on behalf of prisoners of conscience is so important to me and so gratifying. Human rights work is a long game in which a step forward is often followed by 2 or 3 steps backwards. But helping an individual who has been unjustly imprisoned, made to live in miserable conditions, perhaps tortured or deprived of food and medical care, a man or a woman purposefully degraded and humiliated by some government, giving a person in those conditions hope, maybe improving their conditions, maybe even getting them out, that is a great and sustaining thing to do. And the Defending Freedoms Project allows members of Congress to do that good work. I currently advocate for 3 prisoners of conscience: the Panchen Lama of Tibet, Nabil Rajab of Bahrain, and Rafe Badawi of Saudi Arabia. Gendun Churki Nima was a 6-year-old boy when he was chosen on May 15, 1995, by the Dalai Lama to be the 11th Panchen Lama. 2 days later, he and his family were detained by Chinese authorities, and no one has heard from him since. Now he is one of the world's longest-held prisoners of conscience. Today, I renew my call to the Chinese government to provide authenticated videographic evidence of the Panchen Lama's well-being. The Chinese say the Panchen Lama is living a, quote, normal and happy life. Even if true, I want to hear it directly from the Panchen Lama himself. Nabil Rajab is the president of the Bahrain Center for Human Rights. Since 2011, he has been repeatedly and unjustly imprisoned for doing things that should never be criminalized, like participating in protests and writing to the New York Times. Last summer, Nabil was sentenced to 2 years in prison for making, quote, false or malicious, end quote, statements about Bahraini authorities. He faces up to 15 additional years in jail for criticizing Bahrain's participation in the Saudi-led war against Houthi rebels in Yemen and for speaking out about torture in Bahrain's infamous Jaw prison. Nabil's family has asked me today to say that, and I quote, knowing that international voices are speaking up for Nabil gives us great encouragement and means an enormous amount for Nabil during the tough days in prison. That members of Congress are interested in keeping his case and those of other political prisoners on the agenda in Washington helps sustains us through these very difficult times, end quote. The third prisoner I advocate for is Rafe Badawi, the Saudi Arabian founder and editor of a blog to religious and political debate. He's been in prison since 2012. I'd like to share a letter from his wife. My name is Ansaf Haydar. I'm the wife of imprisoned blogger and activist Rafe Badawi, the creator of the website Free Saudi Liberals. I grew up in Saudi Arabia, but now I live in Canada, where my children and I fled for refuge after the imprisonment of my husband in 2012. I'm addressing this commission as a woman, a wife, and a mother of 3 children who believes in her husband's innocence and desperately longs for his release to safety. My husband, Rafe, has been in prison in the city of Jeddah in Saudi Arabia for more than 5 years. Rafe's alleged crime was the creation of this liberal website and his freely expressed criticism of the power of the religious establishment in the country. This website encouraged an online debate on basic issues related to freedom of speech and freedom of belief, as well as women's rights. Rafe was quickly arrested and charged with insulting Islam through electronic channels. He was sentenced on June 17, 2012, to 10 years in prison and up to 1,000 lashes, 50 of which have already been carried out publicly. A committee of physicians determined that his injuries were too serious to carry out the other 950 lashes at the time. Words cannot describe the horror I felt as I watched my husband whipped over and over and over again through video posted online. Every second I spend away from him, I fear for his life. Rafe still has almost 5 more years of his sentence to serve in prison and 950 more lashes on his back to bear. He was sentenced to an additional 10-year travel ban after completing his prison term, meaning that he will not be able to see our children who live with me in Canada until the year 2032. The next time Rafe will see our eldest daughter, she will be 28 years old. The last time she saw him, she was only 8. For the past 5 years, there has been an international outcry for Rafe's freedom. Amnesty International has labeled Rafe's treatment and imprisonment a crime against humanity, and their petition for Rafe's freedom has received over 800,000 signatures. 18 Nobel laureates have signed a letter urging academics from Saudi Arabia to condemn my husband's flogging. He has received awards from the European Parliament, Reporters Without Borders, and many other international organizations. So today I'm incredibly thankful that Congressman Mcgovern has adopted Rafe as part of the Defending Freedoms Project. The Congressman's public-facing advocacy on behalf of Rafe and his repeated letters with Saudi officials in Saudi Arabia urging the government to release him has helped keep repeated pressure and public attention on Rafe's case. The Defending Freedoms Project has inspired a new hope in me that Rafe will soon be released from his unjust imprisonment into the welcoming arms of his family, who have waited many years to embrace him. I am grateful to Congressman Mcgovern and Congressman Hultgren and the members of Congress who formed the Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission and for taking up Rafe's cause. My husband is not a criminal. He's a writer, an independent thinker, a visionary, an activist. He deserves freedom, and our children deserve to grow up with their father with hope and Sav Haidar. And let me just say in closing that what we do as members of Congress to protect and defend human rights matters for our country and for people all over the world. The work we do through the Defending Freedoms Project matters for individuals who are thrown into prison for no reason other than the malfeasance of their governments. I want to thank all my colleagues who are currently advocating for a prisoner of conscience through the Defending Freedoms Project, and I join my colleague, Mr. Hulkran, in encouraging all other members to take on this important work. I thank you, and I yield back my time.
Thank you so much. We're grateful for a terrific panel today. We appreciate the work that you all do, and we're grateful that you're willing to come share with us and talk a little bit about your work, but also hopefully challenge us of what we can be doing. I'm going to introduce the panel, and then we'll just go through and have you present your testimony, and then we'll have time for questions. First, Andrew Fandino is Amnesty International Senior Program Officer with the Individuals at Risk Program. Next, Christina Arriaga is the Vice Chairwoman of the United States Commission on International Religious Freedom. Melina Milazzo is Freedom Now's Washington, D.C. Director, where she is responsible for developing and executing advocacy strategies aimed at freeing individual prisoners of conscience and addressing arbitrary detention. Margot Ewan is the North American Director of Reporters Without Borders, where she runs the U.S. activities for the organization and advocates for journalists, bloggers, and media rights worldwide. And Annie Boyajian is the Advocacy Manager at Freedom House and leads Freedom House's advocacy to the U.S. Congress and collaboration with American human rights groups. Thank you all so much for being here. With that, I'll recognize Mr. Fandino, if you could start us out.
Great. Good afternoon, and thank you to the Tom Lantos Commission for holding this important hearing on defending the prisoners of conscience. I also want to thank the co-chairs for their leadership on this issue that has been very critical for our work. Your work has changed the lives of countless people. Since the Defending Freedoms Project was founded in 2012, dozens of prisoners of conscience have been released and their conditions improved. And that has been due in part due to your pressure and commitment to these cases and people. These prisoners are now free to go back to their homes, to their families, and to try to rebuild their lives again. And I know that they thank you, and Amnesty International thanks you as well. Amnesty International's work on behalf of prisoners of conscience dates back to our founding in 1961, when British lawyer Peter Benenson published an article in The Observer entitled Forgotten Prisoner. Peter was appalled by the fact that 2 Portuguese students had been jailed simply for raising their glasses in a toast to freedom. His article in The Observer urged readers to write letters on behalf of people around the world who were imprisoned solely because of they were exercising the right to basic human rights. The response to Peter's article was enormous, and the letter was reprinted throughout the world. This led to thousands of people writing their own letters to their own government officials. These groups of letter writers in different countries would form the backbone of what Amnesty International is today. Since then, thousands of prisoners have been released, thanks in part to those letters and actions of our members, but also thanks to the letters and actions of members of Congress like you. Amnesty International's work on prisoners of conscience is supported by over 7 million members, supporters, and activists worldwide. Their actions range from writing letters to heads of state, to making calls to foreign embassies in the US, and to visiting their members of Congress requesting additional assistance on cases. Together, these actions sent a very clear message to governments across the globe, that the world is watching. Countless messages have reached presidents, ministers, governors, and in many cases down to the warden where a prisoner of conscience is being held. These concerted actions have led to prisoners being released, their conditions improved, and in some cases, investigations and accountability for their treatment. Another critical role that these messages play, that I cannot emphasize enough, is that it brings much needed hope to these prisoners of conscience. Many prisoners of conscience spend extended periods of time unjustly imprisoned, sometimes for years, in horrendous and cruel conditions. This is especially true for those that are in solitary confinement. For them, knowing that they are not alone, that someone in the outside world is fighting for them every day to get them released from prison, is all that keeps them going sometimes. Amnesty International has a specific program that focuses on getting prisoners of conscience released. and that is the Individuals at Risk program. The Individual at Risk program works to end human rights abuses by getting ordinary individual people to take actions on cases of prisoners of conscience, human rights defenders, and individuals and communities at risk of imprisonment, torture, or even death. The program does this by 3 key initiatives: the Urgent Action Network, the Case Commitment Initiative, and the Rights for Rights campaign. Urgent Action Network responds to human rights emergencies as they arise, when a prisoner is at risk of arrest, when they have been detained, or their health conditions become critical. Our network of activists spring into action and take action. When long-term cases and campaigning is needed, our student and local groups make commitments to a case and make sure that it is resolved through our Case Commitment Initiative. And for the past 15 years, Amnesty International has had an annual campaign known as Right for Rights. Every year, Amnesty chooses between 10 and 12 cases from around the world for a mass global writing campaign. This year alone, almost 2 million people have taken up their call to action. But despite these actions, prisoners of conscience continue to remain in prison. When we finally see some progress on some cases, we are sadly reminded just how tenuous the status of prisoners of conscience is. We only have to look back those past 2 weeks to see that, with the arrest of Amnesty International Turkey's chair, Taner Kilik, and also the conditions surrounding the release of Ethiopian journalist Iskender Nega, whose conditions were just recently dropped just yesterday, to see that this is all too real. So we need to fight for the immediate and unconditional release of all prisoners of conscience, and that is more important than ever. Freedom of expression, association, assembly, and freedom of conscience is under attack around the world. These rights are critical to achieving a world that is more free, just, and secure. Work for individual prisoners of conscience is in fact a work for humanity. This is why Amnesty International USA urges members of the House to co-sponsor and pass the House resolution expressing the support for Prisoners of Conscience Day, which will be introduced by Chairmans Mcgovern and Holmgren. Amnesty also urges members of Congress to take on a case for the Defending Freedoms Project as well. On behalf of Amnesty International, I would like to thank the Lantos Human Rights Commission again for this important hearing and for their commitment to human rights worldwide. I look forward to answering any questions that you might have and working together to release prisoners of conscience throughout the world. Thank you.
Next, Vice Chair Arriaga, thank you. Yeah, if you can pull that close and make sure it's turned on, thank you.
This is good? Okay, thank you. Thank you to the Commission's co-chairs, Representative Holmgren and Mcgovern, for holding today's hearing, and to all other members of Congress who will be coming here later for their advocacy. My name is Christina Arriaga. I serve as the Vice Chairwoman for the United States Commission on International Religious Freedom. We are an independent, bipartisan federal government commission created by the 1998 International Religious Freedom Act to monitor the universal right to freedom of religion or belief abroad and to make recommendations to Congress, the Department of State, and the White House. I would like to request my written testimony be submitted for the record.
Without objection, thank you.
Thank you. Advocating on behalf of prisoners of conscience has been a lifelong passion for me and a high priority for USERF since our inception. We were proud to help launch the Defending Freedoms Project with the Lantos Human Rights Commission in 2012, and we recognize the tireless hours of work of our NGO partners, many of whom are also testifying today. In 2017, USERF also launched the Religious Prisoners of Conscience Project. Our aim is to draw attention to prisoners of conscience and to the flawed laws and policies that led to their imprisonment. Each of the commissioners, including myself, have chosen to advocate for specific individuals. These men and women come from different faiths or no faith at all, from varied political perspectives and parts of the world, but they have all been unjustly imprisoned for exercising one of the most fundamental of human rights. Since the launch of USERF's Religious Prisoners of Conscience, we've seen a little bit of progress. In July of last year, Pastor Thien, a Christian leader in Vietnam, was released almost 6 years early from an 11-year prison sentence. Congressman Lowenthal, Commissioner Jackie Wolcott, an array of human rights organizations, and the State Department all repeatedly raised his case, forcefully condemning his imprisonment and calling for his release. Regrettably, Buddhist leader and dissident Thich Quang Do remains under house arrest in Vietnam, with the Vietnamese government refusing to release him. In Iran, we also saw the release of two Baha'i women whom I had adopted, Fariba Kamalabadi and poet Mavesh Saved, members of the Baha'i Seven. Still, unfortunately, 5 of the Baha'i 7 remain in prison. I have, along with my fellow Vice Chairwoman Sandra Jolly, been advocating for Pastor Andrew Brunson, an American citizen. Pastor Brunson was arrested in Izmir, Turkey in October of 2016 and accused of trying to overthrow the Turkish government. Vice Chairwoman Jolly and I were granted permission to visit Pastor Brunson in prison last October. It was a surreal experience to spend an hour with an innocent man. He doesn't look like this anymore. He's lost over 50 pounds since his arrest and is held in almost complete isolation. He's the only English speaker in his prison. He is the only Christian in his prison. He is never allowed to leave his cell for any reason, except when his wife or the consular officer comes to visit him. There's no cafeteria, there's no exercise area. He is condemned to live in this cell. We call for Pastor Brunson to be released immediately. Finally, let me just quickly highlight a region where I believe too many prisoners of conscience have been forgotten or overlooked: Central Asia. We regularly receive reports and have reported on examples of Muslims, Christians, Jehovah's Witnesses, and others who have been rounded up and imprisoned without due process by governments in this region. In Uzbekistan, the estimated number of prisoners of conscience ranges as high as 10,000. Their names and identities are mostly unknown. In Turkmenistan, prisoners of conscience simply disappear, never to be heard or seen again. In nearby Russia, prisoners do not fare any better. The Jehovah's Witnesses are suffering greatly, and recently Scientologists such as Ivan Masitsky have been rounded up and unjustly imprisoned. Oscar Bisset, the Afro-Cuban medical doctor who has been tortured, beaten in prison, said last year during a short visit to the United States while he was seeking medical treatment before returning to Cuba, he said, "I have a moral obligation to return to Cuba and to help my people gain their freedom." Just last week, I met with a young Catholic priest, born in the Revolution, converted in the Revolution, ordained while the Revolution. His name is Father Castor Jose Alvarez de Besa. He is calling for reform in Cuba so the Cubans can experience the religious freedom they deserve. He looked at me in the eye, and he said he was willing to die, to be tortured, to be imprisoned for freedom. He shed tears because he didn't want to leave his mother behind. He's an only son, but he said he had decided to take that step if necessary. Just last week, he returned to Cuba to advocate for religious freedom. Those of us who have the privilege of living in freedom must stand with those who fight for freedom of religion and belief. We have a moral obligation to speak up. After all, silence is the enabler of the oppressor. Thank you.
Thank you. Next, Ms. Milazzo, if you could share with us.
Thank you. Thank you, Chairman Holmgren, Ranking Member Mcgovern, and all members of the Commission for convening this hearing today. We appreciate your efforts to bring greater exposure to this important initiative and for your leadership on defending prisoners of conscience. My name is Melina Milazzo. I'm the Washington Director of Freedom Now, a legal advocacy organization that works to promote respect for human rights and the rule of law worldwide by helping to free prisoners of conscience and address arbitrary detention. We work to achieve this objective by a strategic blend of international, legal, political, and public relations advocacy efforts. This includes pro bono international legal representation of prisoners of conscience on an individual basis and international advocacy initiatives tackling repressive laws, fair trial rights, and associated violations of human rights, such as torture. Prisoners of conscience are individuals who have been imprisoned as punishment for their nonviolent exercise of a fundamental right, such as expression or belief, political association, or participation in a public demonstration. These courageous individuals dare to speak their minds, engage in independent journalism, organize against corrupt government practices, and seek to practice their religious beliefs independent from government control. In turn, authoritarian governments retaliate, subjecting them to politically motivated trials where the rule of law is ignored and the outcome is predetermined. The legal assistance we provide before international bodies is often a prisoner of conscience's only chance to hold their government accountable. Once these individuals are freed, they can return to their communities and continue their work to protect human rights and root out corruption. Some of our clients have been part of the Defending Freedoms Project, including Vietnamese democracy activist Father Nguyen Van Ly and Mauritanian anti-slavery activist Biram Da Abid, who was awarded the U.S. State Department's Trafficking in Persons Report Heroes Award in 2016. There's no doubt that the Defending Freedoms Project has had a noticeable impact on a number of prisoner of conscience cases around the world, but there are some countries that need more attention. One such country is Azerbaijan. Since 2014, the government of Azerbaijan has overseen a large-scale crackdown on civil society in the country, imprisoning at last count 160 individuals. Some of these individuals include prisoners who have been detained for several years, such as political opposition leader Ilgar Mammadov, youth activist Ilkin Rustamzadeh, and journalist Seymour Hezi. Others have been arrested more recently, such as youth activist Baram Mammadov and Gayas Ibrahimov, or journalist Afghan Mukhtarli. We have seen the Azerbaijani government respond to pressure from the U.S. Congress before, such as when it released journalist Meyman Aliyev in November 2017, after Senator Durbin introduced an amendment withholding U.S. State Department funding from Azerbaijan as long as Meyman remained in prison. However, we need more congressional voices to speak for the many individuals Azerbaijan has silenced. We hope you will consider adopting a prisoner from this country and be their voice. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thanks for your testimony and your work. For the record, I will just say grateful for my co-chairman, Jim Mcgovern, and grateful again. There's so many places where it is partisan. This is one of those that isn't. And so grateful again that we are absolutely teammates and couldn't do this. I couldn't do this without him. So thanks. Thank you for your testimony. And I will now honored to recognize Ms. Ewan for your testimony.
I'd first like to thank Congressman Mcgovern and Hultgren and all the members of the Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission for their outstanding work on behalf of prisoners of conscience. As you know, Reporters Without Borders, also known under its French name, Reporters Sans Frontières, or RSF, is an international nonprofit organization defending freedom of information around the world since 1985. Thanks to a local network of correspondents investigating in 130 countries, 12 offices around the world, and a consultative status at the United Nations and UNESCO, RSF is able to have global impact, gather on-the-ground information, conduct major advocacy campaigns, and assist and defend news providers all across the world. As the great Burmese journalist and politician Winn Thien told us after he was released from 19 years in prison for his views, press freedom is the freedom that allows us to verify the existence of all other freedoms. At the time of this hearing, a total of 324 journalists, citizen journalists, and media assistants are currently behind bars, according to RSF's figures. Around half of the total number of imprisoned journalists are being held in just 5 countries. China and Turkey are still the world's 2 biggest prisons for journalists, followed closely by Syria, Iran, and Vietnam. The Commission's work through the Defending Freedoms Project shines a much-needed light on the imprisonment of news providers around the world. It raises awareness on their case to not only the American people, but to the people of other countries and their governments too, in the hope that pressure from the United States government will ultimately facilitate their release. As we saw this week, 2 journalists from Ethiopia have been released, so we know that good news can happen. RSF must stress that in the current climate of declining press freedom, not only in the world's worst authoritarian regimes, but also in its democracies, the role of this commission is more vital now than ever, especially given the current White House's anti-press rhetoric. The world needs to know that the US government still believes in defending press freedom. RSF has identified several repressive countries across the globe that are currently underrepresented in the project's list of prisoners of conscience. In the former Soviet Union, we recommend that journalists from Azerbaijan, Kazakhstan, Turkmenistan, Russia, and Uzbekistan be added to the list. In the Middle East and North Africa, we recommend adding prisoners from Iran, Egypt, and Morocco. In Africa, we recommend that Sudan be included. In Asia, we recommend adding journalists in Myanmar, Cambodia, and China. And in Latin America, we recommend including Venezuela and Cuba. Any countries I have not mentioned are currently prominently featured on the list. Of course, those journalists should continue to have strong advocates, as many of them already do. If time permits, I would like to just say the names of these journalists. I have submitted my remarks into the record for more information on each individual case.
Great.
In Azerbaijan, journalists Seymour Kazi and Afgan Mukhtarli. In Kazakhstan, Yaroslav Golishkin. In Turkmenistan, Saparmamed Nepeskuliev. In Russia, Igor Rudnikov, Alexander Sokolov, and Zalaudi Gariev. In Uzbekistan, Yusuf Ruzimarodov and Bobomorud Abdullayev. In Iran, Nargis Mohammadi and Sohail Irabi. In Egypt, Ismail Alexandrani and Shokan. In Morocco, Hamid Al-Madawi. In Sudan, Amal Habani. In Myanmar, the two Reuters journalists, which you may have already been familiar with, Walon and Kya So U. In Cambodia, two former Radio Free Asia journalists, Uan Ching and Yang Sotiarin. In China, Huang Qi. In Venezuela, Braulio Hatar, Antonio Medina, and Alberto Cabrera. And in Cuba, Yoani de Jesus Guerra Garcia. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Boyajian. If you would give us your testimony, thank you.
Chairman Hultgren, can you hear me okay? Not on? Light is on. Can you hear me? It's on. Closer. How's that? Normally I'm too loud. Chairman Hultgren, Chairman Mcgovern, I want to thank you both so much for the honor to testify today. As a former Hill staffer who used to track this commission closely, it's especially meaningful. And I want to echo the thanks that my colleagues have given. You two don't have to spend your time on this, but you do. And it is so needed and so effective, and so we all really appreciate it. So thank you so much. Freedom House, as you know, is a 75-year-old nonpartisan organization dedicated to the expansion of freedom and democracy around the world. And we do that through a unique combination of advocacy, research, and on-the-ground programming in highly restrictive environments. And in the 10 years since our emergency programming began, we have supported more than 5,000 human rights defenders, members of religious minorities, and civil society groups in more than 100 countries in their moment of greatest need. We've been able to help them get a lawyer, find medical treatment, support their families when they've been in jail unable to do so, help them return to work, and in many cases, literally save their lives. Unfortunately, we're seeing the need for this emergency programming and long-term programming increase. Our research has documented a 12th straight year of declines in freedom and democracy around the world, including in established democracies, and a corresponding and deeply troubling rise in anti-democratic and authoritarian practices. Space for civil society continues to shrink as free and fair elections, the rights of minorities, freedom of the press, and rule of law come under attack. Modern authoritarian leaders employ nuanced strategies of repression. They exploit open societies by repressing opposition without completely crushing it, flouting the rule of law while maintaining a plausible veneer of order, legitimacy, and prosperity. All of these factors have resulted in a large number of prisoners of conscience around the world, as you've heard. The Commission's Defending Freedoms project highlights prisoners in 17 countries, including China, and indeed, it is impossible to have a hearing about prisoners of conscience without talking about China, which is home to one of the largest populations of prisoners in the world. Documentation is difficult due to the sheer numbers and the secrecy surrounding many of the cases, but Freedom House estimates tens of thousands in detention. That number appears to have skyrocketed over the past year, and Radio Free Asia estimates that more than 120,000 Uyghurs alone are in detention. As Freedom House noted last year in our report on religious freedom in China, religious prisoners form the largest contingent of prisoners of conscience. Yao Guofu and Liang Xin, a married couple jailed since December 2015, are unfortunately a perfect example. Each is serving 4.5 years in prison for disseminating materials about the persecuted Falun Gong spiritual practice. The problem of prisoners of conscience, as you well know, reaches far beyond the countries highlighted in the Defending Freedoms Project. There are around 60,000 political prisoners in Egypt, including human rights defender Hanan Badr el-Din, 233 at the last count in Venezuela, including opposition leader Leopoldo Lopez and Judge Maria Lourdes Afiuni. In Turkey, which you've heard about, tens of thousands were rounded up in the purge that followed the coup attempt, including 157 journalists, American pastor Andrew Brunson, Amnesty International Turkey chair Taner Kilic, and civil society activist Osman Kavala. In Russia, Ayub Titiev, the director of the human rights group Memorial, has been jailed on trumped-up charges since January 9th. As we face rising authoritarianism and other threats to democracies, congressional advocacy is more important than ever. The United States Congress is the most powerful legislative body in the world, and as such, staffers and members are one of the most crucial voices for prisoners of conscience, again, as you both know. Democracy and fundamental freedoms are not side issues. They are the heart and soul of statecraft. Without robust democracy where rule of law is upheld and the rights of minorities are respected, national security and economic prosperity suffer. So the prisoner of conscience languishing in a prison halfway around the world does in fact matter to the United States. They matter not only because the values our nation was founded on require us to care about this person, but also because we are living in an interconnected world. The most important thing we can all do to end the problem of political prisoners is to, of course, eliminate political prisoners. And I look forward to discussing the ways that Congress can work to do this. Thank you.
Well, again, thank you all. We're so grateful for your testimony and even more grateful for your work. I've got a couple questions, and then I'm going to hand it over to my co-chair. First, if I could address Vice Chair Arriaga, if you could talk briefly. I know with USERF, the Frank R. Wolf International Religious Freedom Act requires that USERF compile a list of religious prisoners of conscience. I wonder if you just briefly talk about the criteria, information that's used, and what the current status of that project is.
As you know, this is a brand new mandate that has been added to the Commission's force. We are in the process of analyzing how we are going to do this. We are also making sure that we put in place a verification process that is multi-level to make sure that the information is accurate. So I'm sorry to say this is only at its beginning stages, so I don't have much to add right now.
That's great. If you can keep us updated of how that's going, and if we can be helpful in any way, it's obviously of concern to us and something that Congress is looking forward to hearing more as that moves forward. I would open up maybe to any of you or each of you if you would have a thought or a question, just to talk. And I think we've got a sense from your testimony on this, but I wonder if you could just talk a little bit about what you're seeing in your specific areas where you focus, of some of the trends and trajectories of those who are being targeted. My sense is you're seeing it increase, but I wonder if you could just talk maybe a little bit more about that, and if there are any positive trends that you're seeing out there, and then also just suggestions that you would have of how effective the U.S. government efforts have been in advocating for prisoners of conscience. I do believe it makes a difference when we speak up, when we get on the floor and talk. Is there anything else that we can be doing or encouraging our colleagues to do to have that kind of impact? So I would just open it up to if any of you have any thoughts on those questions.
I'm happy to go first. Thank you for all the work you do. I have worked with political prisoners for over 30 years, and to a person, they have all said that sometimes hearing their name was mentioned in a hearing was enough for them to endure years of torture. Armando Valladares, who spent 22 years in prison in Cuba, he spent 6 of those years in solitary confinement, naked, covered in excrement that the prison guards were throwing on him every single day. He had nothing. And the only thing that kept him going was the ability for him to recreate a world inside of himself. And when he would hear through messages that were passed from other prisoners, which were very rare, that his name had been mentioned in any international forum. So again, thank you. This is life-saving work. I would love it if Congress were to work with the executive branch to enforce the Global Magnitsky Act. Unfortunately, there are a lot of individuals who, in their country of origin, torture people and repress people's religious freedom, and they're still able to come here at Christmas time to New York to go Christmas shopping. That is a travesty. We have a lot of names, and we have a lot of pressure that we can put so those individuals and their relatives do not obtain visas to come to the United States.
Well, Freedom House has documented, as I mentioned, the 12th year of decline. And it's deeply troubling because we're seeing nations like China and Russia return to their more traditionally authoritarian practices like days of old. In China, we're seeing an increased usage in black jails and extra legal detention centers, which have no measure of accountability, and people just disappear to hotel rooms and are tortured and may reappear, may not. And it is indeed a deeply troubling trend. I think on the positives, I would echo the ability that Congress has to really make a difference. One of the proudest moments of my career was a couple who were imprisoned, and their daughter came to the U.S. to meet with members of Congress, including Chairman Mcgovern. And it took 17 months. We had numerous meetings, and the members we talked to were wonderful. They did private letters, public letters, meetings. We even had a protest and rally. We used the appropriations process. And finally, after 17 months, they were reunited, and they are together today, and the couple continues their work. So we do see stories like that being possible. And I would echo Ms. Arriaga, the importance of mentioning someone's name can not only get them released, but can get them treated so much better in prison. And so for Congress, I would recommend 3 things that you two already do so well, which is to use your voice, to be creative, and to be relentless. And I think it's very easy for members to think of adopting a prisoner as, going out and giving a 1-minute speech, and I might not have time, or what if my constituents don't care? But I actually worked for members from the Midwest, and as you well know, constituents do care, and they love when their members show passion about this. And it would be easy to find a political prisoner who matches with interest in your district. For example, a particular faith group or a particular diaspora group, or if you're from a university town, even adopting a scholar. And then there's also the less soft tools like sanctions. So I'm happy to talk more about all of those, but that would be my quick overview to your question.
Well, again, I'm so grateful. Did you have something you want to say?
Really quickly, if there's time.
Perfect.
I wanted to just kind of reiterate something I touched on in my remarks, that Reporters Without Borders has really noticed an overall declining trend with regard to press freedom. Now, we do maybe have a laser-like focus on our mandate at this table, but I think it's really important to highlight how much the world looks to members of Congress as powerful individuals who influence what our country does. And I think that it's more important now than ever that press freedom not be forgotten and not be treated in the way that it has at times been treated by the current administration in the White House. And I'm sorry, I would be remiss not to mention that, because world leaders are looking to our country and taking cues from what we do and how we treat our journalists at home, but also how we treat journalists abroad. And so the advocacy that the members of Congress are taking on behalf of these individuals is powerful. It is noticed. And so I would encourage to keep doing what you have all been doing, but also to take more opportunities when there are key dates, visits of foreign officials into the country, et cetera, to really raise these cases so that they can be more publicly noticed by those foreign leaders that they need to free these journalists or bloggers as soon as possible. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you again for all that you're doing. I'm afraid I'm gonna have to leave a little bit early, but I'm gonna read a letter that one of my colleagues, Representative Chris Smith, had asked if I could read if he was not able to make it. One of the frustrations and challenges of this job is the busyness, and oftentimes all of us, I think, can get caught up in urgent things and miss important things. And I can't think of anything more important than this, standing up for people who are in horrible, horrible conditions. So anyhow, I'd like to read this letter real quickly. Dear U.S. members of the House of Representatives of the U.S. Congress, this was written by Father Nguyen Van Lee and was written on February 2nd, 2018. Dear U.S. members of the House of Representatives and of the U.S. Congress, on behalf of the desperate, poor, and illiterate people in the world and in Vietnam whose basic human rights were oppressed, taken away, or rescinded, I sincerely thank you for your concerns on the sufferings endured by those people and by all of us, although those concerns often have not yet been as fruitful or effective as hoped. I also offer my thankfulness to you on behalf of 169 prisoners of conscience who advocated for human rights, freedom, and democracy in Vietnam and were arrested and imprisoned by the government of Vietnam since 2015 to January 2018. 41 of them were put in jail. Quite often, you have supported them and intervened in their cases by different means. In my particular situation, from 1977 to 2016, your intervention resulted in my early releases from prisons on 4 different occasions. You have visited me several times inside and outside of prisons, especially in my 3rd imprisonment in 2001 to 2005. Congressman Christopher Smith and Senator Sam Brownback visited me in Nam Ha prison, and I got early release 10 years before the end of the prison sentence. Currently, I am still in house arrest with close surveillance at the retired home of Hugh Archdiocese. Thanks again, all of you. Stepping into the year 2018, a dark and sorry veil is covering Vietnam on its democracy and human rights protection. Freedom of speech is lacking. As far as religious freedom, I believe Vietnam should have been designated as a country of particular concern. I hope that you will continue to raise awareness on Vietnam so that all 169 prisoners of conscience, male and female, on the list provided by Dr. Nguyen Dinh Thang of Boat People SOS could be freed. Hence, if all advocates for human rights could garner their right to freedom of movement, they would not be restricted in certain areas and would be free to contribute to building a new Vietnam, a country respecting moral values, being independent, cultural, civilized, free, democratic, safe, stable. We recommend that to be effective, you apply economic, diplomatic, and communicative pressures on Vietnam. We wish you a happy and prosperous 2018 New Year. Yours, thankfully, February 2nd, 2018, Father Tadeo Nguyen Van Lee. And again, that was Congressman Chris Smith had advocated on his behalf. We're also grateful to have Congresswoman Sheila Jackson Lee with us. With this, I will yield to my good friend and co-chairman, Jim Mcgovern, and excuse myself.
Well, thank you very much, and again, thanks for your advocacy. Let me yield to my colleague from Texas. If you have an opening statement, I want to make a few remarks. We'd welcome it at this time.
Mr. Chairman, thank you, and to the chairs and co-chairs, thank you. Thank to all the witnesses for being here. What an important topic of defending prisoners of conscience, and as well to have an exposure of defenders of conscience, so many of them all over the world who are living in unspeakable pain and violence and abuse, maintaining their conscience, but also some who are not so fortunate to be able to even know that they're advocates for their posture. So I was hoping and had invited to testify Ms. Ta Phong Tang, but I will sit in her position, not from my experience, but from my working with her, for she was one of the many fearless and resilient prisoners of conscience that really you all have been speaking of. As I indicated, I thank the commissioners who brought about this hearing, and might I thank the late Tom Lantos for his vision on human rights. He will always be remembered, and I'm privileged to have had the opportunity to not only work with him, but to travel with him, but to hear him speak on a constant basis about those who sacrifice because of conscience. In December 2012, the Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission, in conjunction with the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom and Amnesty International USA, launched the Defending Freedoms Project, which gives members of Congress the opportunity to bring awareness to human rights abuses and encouraging the accountability on behalf of these prisoners. The ability to voice our thoughts and opinions is a powerful right of us to take for a powerful right many of us take for granted. To silence anyone who is fighting a gross injustice, and it is really our duty to stand up for those victims of these abuses. We cannot forget the plight of these prisoners, those I have mentioned, that are living in the midst of violence and not even knowing of the advocacy. Some of them cannot have any engagement with their families or the advocates or those who are in their surrounding areas who are fighting and protesting for them. The sacrifices they have made and the causes they stand for. As Eli Wiesel said, silence encourages the tormentor, never the tormented. According to the Committee to Protect Journalists, 262 journalists have been imprisoned around the world in 2017, which is a new record that surpasses the historical high of 259 journalists imprisoned last year in 2016. I was pleased to adopt Vietnamese political dissident Thien, who was arrested in September 2011 solely for expressing her thoughts as a blogger, criticizing and exposing the government corruption in her home country of Vietnam. Secretary of State John Kerry described her arrest as helping to inspire an awakening to the concern for citizen bloggers and journalists in Vietnam. Thien was sentenced to 10 years in prison, and in the years she was there, she protested the mistreatment of other prisoners. Again, even in her imprisonment, she was defending conscience and those who could not speak for themselves. During this difficult time, Thien suffered through the loss of her mother, who committed suicide by burning herself in protest of her daughter's unjust imprisonment. The desperation of families, the desperation of those incarcerated, the desperation of those who are not connected to even know there's a lifeline, causes this commission to stand for those who are defending on the basis of their conscience, and to really not leave this issue alone. Despite these unfortunate turn of events, Thien has remained resilient and hopeful. She was released in 2015, now resides in the United States, where she continues to fight for justice for the people of Vietnam and the young people of Vietnam. Like Thien, we must never give up, leave no stone unturned in the path for striving to secure basic human rights for repressed people, wherever they may be. We must show the oppressors that the world will not stomach their injustice they unfurl onto innocent individuals. We refuse to leave these prisoners alone in their struggle, and only with our actions can we lead humanity toward a positive change. Thank you to my fellow colleagues who are reading the testimonies of the prisoners of conscience they have adopted through the Defending Freedoms Project. Again, thank you to the advocates and the participants today, including our chair and co-chair. And again, I would like to thank each of the witnesses who are here for your sacrifice and for your voice never being diminished. I know that during the Iraq War and the wars that were so painful in the last 2 decades, many of us would say, not on our watch. And I continue to say that on behalf of the defenders of conscience and those who cannot speak for themselves, that we who can will say loudly, not on our watch. Mr. Chairman, thank you, and with that, I want to yield back.
I want to thank the gentlelady for her comments and her commitment on so many issues related to human rights. We appreciate her voice and all that she does. And the truth is that we could be here, for weeks, months, reading testimonies of prisoners of conscience, and which is a sad reality. But it's an accurate assessment of just how many people are in prison because of who they are, what they believe, have no reason being in prison at all. They make their governments insecure for whatever reason, and it is really tragic. And I think, we take so much for granted in this country, although we're not perfect, and we need to acknowledge that. We can do better, not only in terms of human rights here at home, but in terms of our advocacy of human rights abroad. Mr. Yuan, I agree with you on the issue of we have to be careful what is said here in this country, especially on issues of, freedom of press, because, I have talked to reporters who, as the anti-press rhetoric has increased, have been getting threats. And then, we're also setting an example for the rest of the world. And the example we set ought to be a good one, not one that, not the one that we're setting right now. But before I go to some questions, I'd like to recognize my colleague from California, Congressman Alan Lowenthal, and want to yield to him for whatever time he would like to speak or ask questions or whatever. Okay?
Thank you.
But put your microphone on, otherwise we can't hear you.
Informed, I was on an Aspen trip leaving to Rwanda and Ethiopia. It's just been canceled, so I have a week to talk now. As I may. Well, thank you, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you to today's hearing being hosted by the Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission on the issue of prisoners of conscience. Since the launch of the Defending Freedom Project in 2012, members of Congress have advocated on behalf of prisoners of conscience to bring awareness to human rights abuses around the world. As you know, many of these prisoners are jailed for their pro-democracy activism or for speaking out against unjust laws within their country. And the work of the Defending Freedom Project has been crucial in saving lives. We've had many successes. I'm glad to say that 2 of my former prisoners of conscience have been released. Most recently, Pastor Winn Chin, a longtime pro-democracy activist, was released last year through collective efforts by members of Congress and the United States State Department. I adopted Pastor Chin as my prisoner of conscience in 2014. In exercising his religious freedom, Pastor Chin was sentenced to 11 years in prison under the false charges of undermining national solidarity. In prison, he was physically and verbally abused by the authorities and was denied medical treatment. His wife and their 5 children were constantly harassed, monitored, and sometimes violently attacked by plainclothes public security forces. The Vietnamese government released Pastor Winn Chin under the condition that he immediately leave the country in exile. Pastor Chin and his family now reside in the United States. Although Pastor Chin has been freed, other prisoners of conscience are often not so lucky. And I want to highlight the case now of the most venerable Thich Quang Do, the supreme patriarch of the United Buddhist Church of Vietnam. The patriarch has been jailed numerous times for leading nonviolent protests against the Vietnamese government, and he has called for religious freedom. He is currently under house arrest in Vietnam. The most venerable Thich Quang Do became a monk at the age of 14, and he witnessed the execution of his religious master later on when he was then 17. His master had simply helped to relieve victims of the grave famine in North Vietnam. But the communists accused him of using religion as an opium of the people, and they shot him dead. I want to read a statement from the most venerable Thich Quang Do. Letter to me, dear Congressman Lowenthal, I am informed by the UBCF-CV's international spokesman, Mr. Rafe Badawi, that you will be speaking at a hearing in the U.S. Congress on religious freedom and human rights in Vietnam. I am happy to learn that the U.S. Congress is concerned about human rights in my country. Recently, Vietnam has intensified repression against civil society activists, religious followers, and human rights defenders on an unprecedented scale. We Vietnamese are not afraid to speak out, and today many young people are using their blogs or staging demonstrations to demand respect of the environment, freedom of expression, association, and religion. But our voices are weak, for the Vietnamese authorities use their massive police force, unfair judiciary system, and vast network of prisons to stifle our legitimate appeals. This is why hearings in the United States Congress are so important, for they amplify the voices of all of those who are putting their safety on the line to express their ideals and beliefs. I speak as a victim with firsthand experiences of over 3 decades of repression. When I was just 19, I witnessed the summary execution of my Buddhist master in North Vietnam. After 1975, when Vietnam was united under communist rule, I was imprisoned, harassed, condemned to internal exile for 10 years, then imprisoned again, and finally placed under house arrest at the Thanh Minh Zen monastery in Saigon for the crime of launching an appeal for democracy in Vietnam. Since then, I've remained under house arrest without any due process of law. I'm under constant police surveillance, my communications are monitored, and I am forbidden to travel. My letter to you today was sent through underground channels. The Unified Buddhist Church of Vietnam, the UBCF, it is the Unified Church of Vietnam, of which I am the leader, is not recognized by the authorities, and our members suffer daily harassments, intimidation, repression, and detention. Vietnam has adopted a new law on belief and religion, which came into force this month, but the authorities continue to persecute independent religious communities such as the UBCV. Today's word is focused on business, trade, and development. But economic development is only sustainable if it is built on the foundation of democratic freedoms and human rights. I urge you to do your utmost in the halls of the United States Congress and beyond to speak out loud and clear in defense of democracy and to keep up the fight to win freedom for all those who are deprived of their liberty simply for the peaceful exercise of their convictions and beliefs. Yours sincerely, and that's Thich Quang Do, the 5th Supreme Patriarch of the Unified Buddhist Church of Vietnam. You know, prisoners of conscience are not only persecuted for their religious belief, but often for defending human rights abuses. My current prisoner of conscience, Winn Van Dai, is a Vietnamese human rights lawyer and blogger. He has traveled throughout Vietnam to teach law students and to train young human rights defenders on human rights reporting mechanisms and how to deal with police interrogation. Dai has been tried for conducting propaganda against the state, sentenced to prison, and forced to close his offices. The Vietnamese government has denied Dai legal representation. In January of 2018, his wife visited him for the first time in 3 years. She reports that he does not look like he's in good health. Dai also told her that he has almost never been allowed out of his cell during the entire time he's been in jail, and that began in December of 2015. The work that advocates take on behalf of prisoners of conscience is very important. From speaking out about these issues to holding briefings or hearings or even raising concerns in the country in which the prisoner is detained, it helps bring awareness about prisoners and open discussion about much-needed reform. Lastly, I just want to conclude by reading testimony from another former prisoner of conscience of mine, Nguyen Thien Truong, a Vietnamese blogger and activist who credits the work of the Tom Lantos Commission on his release. And I'm just going to read this one statement, and then I'll complete my thought. I am Nguyen Thien Truong from Saigon, Vietnam. In 2006, while studying in France, I founded the organization Viet Youth for Democracy and joined the Democratic Party of Vietnam. I also wrote many articles on BBC Vietnamese to advocate for the democratization of my country. After coming back to Vietnam in 2007, the communist government forced me to join the army on March 5th, 2008. It's their way to restrict my movement, a kind of informal prison. As I refused to pledge allegiance to the Communist Party, I was expelled from the Army on July 6, 2009, and I was arrested on the very next day, July 7th of 2009. Was sentenced to 7 years in jail, 3 years on probation for the charge of, quotes, taking activities aiming at overthrowing the people's government. 3 of my colleagues were also convicted of this charge in the same case with me. It was an injustice for me as the freedom of expression, association, and assembly are international standards of human rights. These rights are also recognized by the Communist Party of Vietnam in their self-imposed constitution. During my seemingly endless days in the communist prison, I had more strength to overcome the hardship because my relatives had informed me that the U.S. Congress paid particular attention to my case. That's why the prison guards treated me with leniency, and I was released earlier than expected on April 12, 2014, instead of July 7, 2016. My 3-year probation ended on April 12, 2017, and I met Congressman Lowenthal in Saigon during this period. I was lucky because Congressman Alan Lowenthal and other congressmen always sought opportunities to speak out for my case. However, there are still many prisoners of conscience in Vietnam, including many of my colleagues. That's why I am appealing to Congress to continue your support for democratic activists and prisoners of conscience in Vietnam. Your support is precious to us and makes us mentally stronger. I hope to study in the United States in one of these fields, political science, development economics, public policy, public management, or constitutional law. I believe Vietnam in the post-communist era will be in dire need of experts in these fields. I hope that I may meet members of the Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission in the near future to express my profound gratitude towards the U.S. Congress and in particular Congressman Lowenthal. Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I yield back.
Thank you very much. I appreciate very much your testimony and the statements. Does anyone have an idea how many prisoners of conscience there are in the world today? Yeah.
So I couldn't find a good count. I looked. It has to be hundreds. Sorry. I could not find a good count. I actually was looking ahead of this hearing. It has to be in the hundreds of thousands if you listen just to the numbers we've talked about, and the countries are only a fraction.
All right. You know, we've read some testimonies here about prisoners of conscience who have benefited from the advocacy of this commission, and that's gratifying to all of us because we're making a difference. But the bottom line is that we need to do better, and I want to pose a question to you about how we can sharpen our advocacy or how we can expand it in a way that we can do better. One of my frustrations is that you're never going to meet a politician in Washington who tells you they're pro-human rights violations, right? Everybody is outraged over, at least they say they're outraged over prisoners of conscience, people whose human rights are being violated on a regular basis. And yet, when we try to turn that talk into action, sometimes it's a little bit challenging. And it's challenging is because we have a lot of interests, trade, economic interests. And so while people will say, it's terrible that there's somebody who is being held as a prisoner of conscience in, let's say, China, there seems to be a reluctance by official Washington to push hard because we have so many business interests. Or there's some strategic interest that involves our military that is involved. I mean, there's always kind of these excuses as to why we can't push harder. And, I'm now convinced that we need to kind of expand our pressure, not just, amongst our colleagues in Congress, and part of our goal here is to get more and more people to adopt a prisoner of conscience, not just more pressure on the White House, which, to be honest with you, has been disappointing to me that they've been in some of these countries where there are lots of prisoners of conscience and human rights never gets mentioned, but we're going to continue to pressure the administration. But I also think we need to expand this to put more pressure on the business community. the United States business community and the multinational business community. You know, I mean, the fact of the matter is that some of these countries benefit greatly from our businesses and trade, and their economies, you know, thrive because of interaction with our business community. And yet, you know, by and large, with very few exceptions, the business community is silent. I mean, and you know, it's something maybe we obviously can't legislate, but you know, there ought to be a concerted campaign targeting key businesses, you know, that do business in some of these countries that have terrible human rights records, to actually speak up, because silence means you're complicit. And you know, or even, you know, I mean, I've had conversations with a number of companies who have told me things like, you know, they agree that things are, you know, things in the country. I'll give you, without revealing names here, you know, we did a recent trip to India and met with His Holiness the Dalai Lama to talk about the plight of the Tibetan community. We also visited Nepal, where a lot of Tibetan refugees are being mistreated or being sent back to China. And we talked to I talked to some of the businesses that do a lot of U.S.-based businesses that do a lot of business in China and in Nepal, and they all agree, you know, when we're behind closed doors, that the treatment of the Tibetans is terrible, but they don't raise their voice. I don't think China's going to kick them out of China because China wants their business. But part of our effectiveness here is to make China feel uncomfortable. And if members of Congress getting on the floor and giving speeches about prisoners of conscience doesn't do it, then we need to start thinking about how we add to that. We have this Global Magnitsky Act that will hopefully provide us, you know, some avenues. But even beyond that, I think we need to find ways to get others involved in this campaign. And I'd just like to get your assessment of that, or other concrete actions that we can take to put a little bit more power behind what we're trying to do here. I open it up to, yeah. Ms. Ewan?
Thank you so much for highlighting that. I think everyone at this table will agree with you that the business community does need to be pressured. In particular, at times, the technological industry, social media networks do play a role in repression in countries like Vietnam, in Turkey, etc. The list is too long to name all of the countries here. Another potential link with the work that we all do is journalists who try and undercover corruption in different countries and are then imprisoned for doing so. The link between money flows and the work of journalists or other prisoners of conscience that may have revealed information that is vital to expelling corruption and promoting democracy, I think is something that the U.S. Congress can explore more. For example, World Bank loans given to certain countries like Azerbaijan to reform their judicial system, which then, as you know, imprisons many journalists. It's not just Reporters Without Borders that mentioned journalists from Azerbaijan on this panel today. It's overwhelming, a country that was mentioned by almost everyone on this panel. So I think that the voice of U.S. Congress members is strong enough to put public pressure simply by tweeting or making statements alluding to the need for the business community to publicly denounce imprisonment of prisoners of conscience, especially when it comes to eradicating corruption, which is one of the fundamental pillars of the work of the World Bank, for example.
I think there's a huge opportunity for the general public to get engaged as well. There was a group of us having a conversation with your friend and former colleague, former Congressman Frank Wolf, about this very issue, about the importance of engaging with businesses who are selling surveillance equipment, who are selling technology equipment that is then turned around and used to repress people. There are so many members of the American public who are passionate about this issue. They should engage not only with U.S. government, but with the companies to put pressure on the companies, and also to support companies. situations like Marriott getting bullied into changing their website, for example, are absurd
Right.
and should not happen. This is the United States. You're not a Chinese company. You don't have to be bullied by the Chinese government. And there's also a big opportunity as we are having a very important discussion here in the United States about using taxpayer dollars effectively and what do we want our budget to look like and how do we want to engage overseas. The American public has a great opportunity to weigh in on the importance of democracy funding and governance funding. Right now, it's only 0.05% of the federal budget, and we unfortunately saw in President Trump's proposed budget a recommended cut of more than 40% to these programs. Well, if you want to use taxpayer dollars wisely, you should be investing in these issues so you save on defense costs on the back end so that you hopefully put organizations like ours out of business. We would rather not be here advocating about political prisoners. And so I think the apathy of the American public really should be challenged because they can engage and have a lot of power, I think.
Right, I think the American public has a conscience too, right? I mean, part of it is making sure they understand, who are good players and who are bad players. And whether it's surveillance companies or clothing companies or I don't care what kind of companies, if they are making money, in places that are exploiting people where there are lots of prisoners of conscience, then we want them to use their voice. If not, we don't want to buy their products. Yeah, Ms. Arriaga?
Thank you. I have two very specific suggestions,
Good.
if I may. The United States Commissioner on International Religious Freedom has been working with a relatively newly formed group called the International Panel of Parliamentarians for Freedom of Religion or Belief. And even though we are a very powerful country, we do know that sometimes the fact that an American is advocating for a political prisoner in and of itself may not take it to the next level of release. The IPP4, we have been cooperating with them. For instance, in the case of Pastor Brunson, the president has mentioned his name, the vice president has mentioned his name. So whenever you're dealing with foreign embassies and other matters, it may be a good issue to bring up. Just recently, both the French government and the German government were able to get their nationals released from Turkey as a gesture, as a Christmas gesture from Erdogan. And however, we cannot obtain the release of Pastor Brunson. IPP4 has asked for American members of Congress to join them, and that could be a terrific thing to do. The other is congressional delegations. If CODOs would let USERV know when they were going to a particular country, we can provide a list of individuals whose names they can bring up. And sometimes, just as we have mentioned, if someone goes in for a trade trip or an unrelated trip, if they just hand over a piece of paper with 3 or 4 names, I'm interested in finding out what the status of these individuals are, that alone raises the profile of these individuals. But USERV has no way of knowing when CODOs are happening, so if there were a way to do an interagency coordinating body that would notify when people were traveling, that would be terrific. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Fendino?
Yes, thank you. I think I just emphasize the importance that Congress can play in holding the business community accountable. I think there's countless stories that we hear as organizations working throughout Southeast Asia and Africa and Central America of companies that are blatantly violating both domestic and international human rights and holding prisoners of conscience for extended periods of time. I think just the importance of members of Congress, the embassy, to openly denounce that. I know in a lot of cases where, these companies just feel very, just blatantly being able to operate that way and not feeling like there's no repercussions for that, I think is very important for that to continue to happen. And, members with your colleague letters, bringing these up in statements, but also, CODELs, I think is really important, and having the embassy on the ground actually making statements on behalf of human rights defenders, I think is a very essential part. And as we've seen, I think in all our work is a trend of attacks against human rights defenders who are working on issues around businesses on the floor. And so a lot of indigenous organizations and organizations and communities that are working on land and environmental and indigenous rights are being particularly targeted. And so I think it's an essential role that the U.S. Congress can continue to play in pushing the White House and the State Department to make statements on behalf of these cases, and having the embassy be more vocal in supporting these organizations and holding people accountable. Thank you.
Just one last, before I turn it over to my colleagues here. I mean, I think Mr. Hultgren kind of alluded to this, but I mean, are things getting worse? Or are they kind of stable? Or are they getting better?
So in terms of Freedom House research, I would say they're better than the Cold War era. You know, we have our 75 years of data. The 12-year decline is deeply troubling. I am an eternal optimist, so I'm going to say we have to watch closely, but we can make headway. The people I work with, the activists on the ground, the change makers who we all want to support, they are committed to doing this, and if we can give them a little bit of help, it can get better.
I mean, I would think with reporters, things are getting worse.
Yes. In our World Press Freedom Index that we published last spring in 2017, we reported that media freedom around the world had never been under such threat. And as I alluded to in my remarks, it's not just authoritarian regimes that are sticking their heels in. It's democracies that are now taking cues from some authoritarian tactics, implementing legislation that is very concerning. For example, in the UK, Snoopers Charter was adopted, which criminalizes leaking classified information. That's very concerning from a democracy, from a US ally. And so when these kinds of incidents happen around the world, the United States needs to play that leader role. And you know, in terms of what's happening here on the ground for press freedom, we are noticing a decline in U.S. press freedom, and that has a direct consequence on that freedom in other countries in the world.
Anything else?
I mean, I think there is two other concerning trends in terms of worsening situations. If we look at attacks against human rights defenders, last year alone, there were, according to Frontline Defenders, there were 312 human rights defenders that were killed. Just an increasing pattern of criminalization throughout the world, as well as dissidents, and not just human rights defenders, but just anyone really criticizing the government. And so that's really preoccupying, as well as the use and misuse of laws to silence anyone that opposes the government or criticizes the government. And so I think that's of extreme concern, and kind of the importance to highlight that in any kind of state meetings that are happening.
All right, thank you. Yeah, sorry. Go.
We see a lot of deterioration at the United States Commission on International Religious Freedom, but we're also very hopeful. This year alone, I've been to, Egypt and Turkey, Saudi Arabia, in Burma, and in all these places, human rights activists are able to access social media directly.
Right.
There is no longer that filtering process that happened before when these instruments were not available. So I would urge Congress to be creative with monitoring social media, but also aggregating to those who are reporting plights from their own country. And it's a great opportunity that we have now, and we should take advantage of it.
Colleagues, you want to
Yeah,
say something?
I want to comment on two things. One that you've brought up. One is how, besides having prisoners of conscience, which I think are very important, do we ramp up the pressure on these countries? I can just share with you, and I think timing is very important, and we'll come back again. What I mean by that is I had visited Vietnam when the discussions were on the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the TPP. And my role, and the Vietnamese government knew it, and I was also although a minority member on the Foreign Affairs Committee at that time, on subcommittee on Asia. I played the bad cop with the group. By that, I was very clear with the Vietnamese government and with businesses that were dealing in Vietnam that if they wanted my vote for the TPP, they had to deal with human rights and religious freedom and political dissent in Vietnam, that had to be on the table during these negotiations. We will again be developing trade relationships with these countries. We're not going to move away. As we say, businesses, we're now in a global economy. I think there are unique opportunities for the United States and for Congress to play a role to make sure that, as Taekwondo had said in his letter, that when we develop economic trade relationships, we make sure that they are within a context of promoting human rights and religious freedom and as part of our economic development message, or else we don't have to play. And we can tell businesses, you want us to play, you have to be also our spokesman. So I think that is a critical part of getting when we begin these negotiations. I will also say I'm a little worried about democracy at this moment in the world. My district, besides having a very large Vietnamese American community, also has a very large Cambodian community. I represent Cambodia Town. And the Cambodian government has which had been on a democratic experiment since the mid-1990s after going through the killing fields and a horrible experience of genocide, had moved towards democracy. But it's now moved away from democracy in terms of an authoritarian, autocratic ruler, Hun Sen, who has eliminated all political opposition, any opposition, any speaking out. People are arrested. There's the elimination of political parties. And I too am quite surprised that, and although we've talked out that the United States government and administration hasn't taken a stronger stand, I just believe that much of what we do in the world is when we are perceived as the moral leader, as the one that promotes these values. It's not that we're not that leader, but we're not promoting those values. They are secondary right now to economic development. And I'm watching, I think, a deterioration in the promotion of democracy. And so it really bothers me a lot.
Thank you. Ms. Jackson-Lee, any last thoughts?
Yes, I would. Thank you so very much. I wanted to recite a line in your testimony, Margaret, that I think is particularly useful, and I probably just change your name. So a line in your testimony, Margot, that I think is very pertinent overall, and that is the line that you put in from the Burmese journalist that indicated, and I think it's just a horror story, that he was incarcerated for 19 years. And there's so many around the world that are now in that plight. And this is relating to press, but it says press freedom is a freedom that allows us to verify the existence of all other freedoms: religious freedom, freedom of access, freedom of speech. So I wanted just one person to comment on their familiarity with the conditions in Russia and the number of political prisoners and/or prisoners on the basis of their press, their freedom of speech or freedom of press. Does anyone have an assessment? Because I think I heard mention the Cold War, and from my perspective, Russia is returning under a Putin's Russia to that kind of despotic leadership and setting the tone for a number of surrounding countries to feel that it is all right. Erdogan in Turkey has done like a 180-degree turn from 5, 6, 7 years ago when secular Turkey was booming, and as well as those who were religious, who had the same freedom to express any level of faith that they had. Turkey is known as a Muslim country, but it seems as if in modern day societies, 21st century, we're now turning our heads backwards. Someone on Russia, what's either the number of people from press or political prisoners? Go right ahead.
Well, as you may know, there have been recent laws that were adopted in Russia to label groups that were in dissidence with the government as extremist groups. And these laws were applied arbitrarily. So as a result, for instance, the Jehovah's Witnesses have now been deemed an extremist group. They're no longer allowed to exist. They're a pacifist group that didn't want to be involved with the government. But Putin is destroying civil society. Anyone who does not subscribe to his agenda will now be considered an extremist. The Jehovah's Witnesses had film footage of Russian agents coming in to plant information in their places of worship and then discovering it the next day. And even with that information, they were unable to prevail in court. The Scientologists have recently been targeted. Several Scientologists have been imprisoned and or under house arrest. So the destruction of civil society, I believe, starts with the destruction of any independent body, particularly those people who seek to live according to their conscience. So whenever religious freedom is in crisis in a country, you're right, it's about to go after reporters, it's about to go after anyone who stands up for their conscience.
Well, Christina, would you just allow me to pursue that a little bit? Would you have a guesstimate of how many political prisoners of varying types? Because they're layered. There are those who were there 10, 15 years ago and they're still there. They might have been political. Then you're telling me of the rising attack on various religions. You would say or be able to speculate with facts that Russia has a sizable population of dissidents imprisoned?
Yes. One of the reasons that is very difficult to come up with data, and Freedom House does such a terrific job with this, is that in the era of the refuseniks, and I'm old enough to remember when the Russians were in prison and Tom Lantos advocated for them, it was very clear when the government arrested someone who was a political prisoner and who wasn't. Now, governments got smart about this, so many of the people arrested get arrested as a security threat, or violating the extremist law, or being member of a terrorist organizations. Hindus in Russia are now considered also a terrorist organization. So it's very difficult to come up with numbers because government themselves are no longer reporting on the kind of arrests they're conducting.
Did Freedom House have any numbers you selected?
So I actually talked to my colleagues about that, and I would just say it is hard to pin down a specific number. It is indeed an increasing problem. We have seen not only, as you mentioned, increasing authoritarian tactics in Russia, but the surrounding nations adopting those tactics and additional prisoners in those nations as well. And so I think the problem you highlight is very real and quite critical.
Let me conclude on this, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for that edification. It's interesting because Russia is touted as certainly a world power with the personification of a modern, slick nation. And we know Russia of yesteryear or the Soviet Union as an oppressive society. And I really think it's important that we tell the truth, that Russia is compounding the Soviet Union's actions. The old dissidents are still there. New dissidents are coming, and there are expanded criteria for making you in violation of the government's desires, new extremist definitions. And I just want to put on the record, we have an administration that seems to completely be blinded as it relates to Putin's oppression and the expanded reach of oppression in Russia. And Russia, therefore, is allowed to impress upon surrounding nations or nations as far away as Syria that what they're doing is good. And I'm appalled, even though the sanctions was somewhat unrelated, for our administration not to issue sanctions on Russia in the current time. And as well, I am concerned that the present administration, albeit America's democracy is strong, has made comments about the press that I think are not helpful or do not give to the world the values that Americans have about freedom of press, freedom of speech. And so it looks like we are intertwined with a Putin's oppression and walking step in step. And I, for one, don't like it. And I think more of us need to rise up and say this is not, we're not Putin's America, and we don't want to have Putin's Russia. And we want the people of Russia to have the same freedoms of which the breakup of the Soviet Union was to create, which is not to change their style of government, but to allow people to live. As you indicated, the Jehovah's Witnesses did not want to be wrapped up in any political issues. They just wanted to practice as they practice. Now, of their faith, they are declared an extremist for inaction, for just trying to be adhering to their faith. So I thank you for this testimony, and I hope that it inspires us to know that we have to go broader than what we are as it relates to protection of these people of conscience. I yield back.
I thank my colleague, and I want to thank all of you. Look, I mean, I think we need to aspire to become a government that is not silent in the face of human rights abuses because it's inconvenient for us to raise the issue for whatever reason. And I have strong criticisms of our current administration, but if I'm going to be totally honest, I've had criticisms with every administration that I've ever served with, that there hasn't been the consistency, although I really have some real issues about the direction our country's moving in terms of human rights in general under this current administration. But having said that, you know, I appreciate all of your advocacy. There's for those in the audience, there's a list of unadopted prisoners of conscience on the table. I hope you will take them and try to get your member of Congress, or if you know any members of Congress, to adopt 1, 2, or 3, and work with us on this. You know, and I'll just close by saying, you know, I'm just really impatient, like you all are. I mean, I say this a lot. I mean, I used to think the older I got, the more I would like understand things, and the older I'm getting, the more I'm puzzled by the fact that there are so many people in this world who, you know, arrest people because of who they are, or mistreat them because of who they are, or what they believe, or, you know, it's just such a destructive waste of energy and time, and it is just so wrong, and I just feel that we're not pushing back hard enough. I'm saying that all of us collectively. That's why I was asking before about, you know, thinking a little bit out of the box, different approaches that we might be able to embrace to strengthen our advocacy. And so I urge all of you, I mean, as you gave me some suggestions here today, but if you think of things, please share that with the commission, because, you know, I've visited many of these prisoners of conscience in prisons all around the world. I can't imagine what they're going through, their families. You know, I mean, when these prisoners of conscience are put in jail, I mean, it has a corrosive effect on civil society. If it's a reporter, it sends a chilling signal to all reporters. If it's an academic, it sends a chilling signal to academics. If it's a faith-based leader or somebody who just wants to practice a religion that may be a minority religion in a particular country and they're arrested, that sends a chilling signal to everybody. And so it's just, so in any event, this has been very, very helpful. Thank you for all that you do, and look forward to working with you when the hearing has come to an end. Thanks.